Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kali Collier. My PhD is in philosophy and religion with a concentration in women's spirituality, and Inanna is very near and dear to my heart because she was one of the main goddesses that we actually study. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I really appreciate your being here, your time and attention, and I hope that you find my presentation interesting and thought-provoking. One moment. There we go. Okay. I would like to offer a small warning. There will always be people who unwittingly conflate their identity politics with their research. And these people will often tell you with absolute confidence that their interpretation is the only one true way. And trust me, it's unfortunately not, because mythologies are not static. Instead, they're always changing along with the cultures that they're connected to. Even the ancient ones change depending on your time frame of study. And quite frankly, we have absolutely no way of knowing if our perspective on the lives and beliefs of the ancients are wrong or right. So, keep an eye out for those teachers who don't tell you they're relating their own beliefs, or whose dated sources are from an earlier and more misogynistic time, or whose depiction of the ancient world just happens to map beautifully onto the modern world. Feel free to question. And I really want to encourage you, please feel free to question, because it's one thing to try and borrow symbolism in order to live better lives. I've seen a lot of that this week, and it's what I'm going to try and do too. But it's another entirely to effectively appropriate ancient texts or artifacts to support one's pet theory. And again, please feel free to ask me about this in the questions. And finally, I'd like to take a moment to give credit where it's due. I am much indebted to both Judy Gran and Betty Deschong-Meador for introducing me to Inanna and their wonderfully rich classes and work, for validation of my own thoughts and giving me marvelous new ideas, and also for their lovely lyrical, literary translations of the Sumerian. Their interpretations of the written language aren't word for word, but I have seen examples of word for word translations, and honestly, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us today. And so I think a literary translation is a far better and more emotionally honest means of hearing these writings today. So let us start to set the scene for the story. The world of ancient Sumer. It has a very different perspective on life. So let's start with life itself. The area is semi-arid, with a vast desert in the north, and in the south, there's something like 5,800 square miles of marshes, lagoons, mudflats, and reed banks. Now, at the time, the sea came much further north than it does in our current day. And that's why Ur was actually almost a sea city at the time. The nearby mountains and foothills are going to be covered with oak and pistachio and ash forests. It'll be interspersed with camel thorn, which is a really nasty tree, and gaff tree, which is also known as Persian mesquite. And that is a tree that is really, really useful for humans. By the waters, you'll find abundant reeds, narrow-leaved cattails, and the giant Mardi reed is the one that's used for construction material. The Euphrates poplar tree and the Babylonian weeping willow will grow in small belts beside the big, ever-changing rivers too. It is beautiful and lush in spring, but it's also dangerous because there's a lot of wildlife. There's gazelle, there's roe deer, there's giraffes, there's onagers, wild boars, wild goats, and also further out from the city, you'll find Asiatic lions and leopards, hyenas, owls and falcons, crocodiles, even in some places, Asiatic elephants. Of course, closer in by the cities, there's going to be the domesticated Bactrian camels and water buffalo, as well as the ubiquitous herds of sheep, goats, and camel. But that is not all that is sacred about life here. It was literally only a few centuries ago that Nisaba gave us her miraculous gift of writing. She is the goddess of writing, accounting, surveying, and grain, and she is referred to as the lady. In the place where she approaches, there is writing. Without Nisaba, harvests cannot be calculated, nor bread and beer offerings apportioned. But she doesn't have temples of her own, which is interesting. Her sanctuaries are attached to libraries and scribal houses, and worshiping her consists primarily of either praise songs or simply using her gift of writing. And it is truly an amazing gift. With this, you can speak to other people that are beyond your sight, that are beyond your hearing, even from generation to generation. And it is thanks to this miraculous gift that we today know these stories. So Enheduanna is the first named author of history, long before Homer. Her title name can be translated as En, which means chief priestess, and then Hedu, which means ornament, and then Anna, which means of heaven, which translates as the ornament of heaven, which I love. She was the daughter of Sargon, the empire maker, and it's clear he had enormous trust in his young daughter because at some point after ascending the throne, he sent her to Ur to be the high priestess of the moon god, Nana Suen, and effectively a political power for her father, since the role of high priestess held a similar level of honor, power, and respect as would a king. Now we know the names of the people in the slide that I've got showing there because they were actually written on the disc itself. And then, as I say in the slide on the back, there is an inscription to Enheduanna and to Inanna. I'm not going to read it because I always find it very irritating when people read the slides. It's like I can read it myself. So if anyone has any questions about it, though, feel free to say, I'm sorry it was too small, I couldn't read it, and I'm happy to read it to you after I'm done. So scholar Paul Kriwacek writes about this particular calcite disc, and this is a quote from him. Records suggest that offerings continued to be made to these dead priestesses, called the resting ones. That one of the most striking artifacts, physical proof of Enheduanna's existence, was found in a layer datable to many centuries after her lifetime, makes it likely that she in particular was remembered and honored long after the fall of the dynasty that had appointed her to the management of the temple. And I love that she was remembered so long and so well. It is in fact due to Enheduanna's brilliant compositions of holy texts that she effectively blended the sacred rituals and stories of Sumerian Inanna with those of Akkadian Ishtar. And by doing that, by bringing them together, she was critical in uniting the north and south regions of her father's empire via shared religious beliefs and symbolism. One thing we have to keep strictly in mind, however, is that Inanna herself is a very complex and ambiguous deity. We have to approach her with extreme caution so we don't accidentally assume she will be what we expect of modern women. As the goddess of love, sexual pleasure, cosmic justice, war, and several other concepts as well, she is definitely not a product of patriarchal binary thinking. Instead, we have to try to remember how cyclical life was for the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians. Pardon me. Unlike a straight line, which can only have two sides, a circle can cycle endlessly, and we see this in the beliefs of the time. Life is born, it lives and procreates, eventually it dies, and it is reborn again as the cycle continues. The winter floods bring the summer harvests, just as the sun dies into the underworld each night and is reborn in the morning, and just as the moon, each 28th night, is also believed by the Sumerians to die into the underworld and to be reborn. Regarding Inanna herself, her symbols reflect her complex and multifaceted nature. For example, the 8-petaled desert rose, which reflects her star. We can see it in the sculpture Rearing Goat with a Flowering Plant, which is also known as Ram in a Thicket because its discoverer, British archaeologist Sir Charles Leonard Woolley, really liked biblical allusions, which was unfortunate because this was long before the Bible. But the sculpture is precise enough that we can even tell the goat's breed and sex. It's a female Markhor goat, and there is a matching male goat sculpture. And they, we believe, frame, and they have, I don't know if you can see it, well, you can see it a little bit in the picture. There's sort of a stick coming out of the back of the goat, and they think that that was used to brace like an urn or a vase or something between the two goats. There's also the cylinder seal up in the other corner. And that one's interesting because it shows how symbolism can layer and become more and more complex. In this particular example, the shepherd king, which is possibly Dumuzi, is feeding Inanna's sacred herd with roses next to her temple, which is obvious by the door framed by reed bundles and the libation urns which are standing within. The young sheep inside also symbolically conflates Inanna's temple with a sheepcote, which is where the sheep were bred and gave birth, which represents Inanna's cycle of life as well as her gift of sexual pleasure to her people. And the sacred herd depicted, which is, of course, one female and one male, are also iconic of her people. And her care for them is shown by Dumuzi the shepherd, her beloved, feeding them the roses, which represent her. However, we have to keep in mind these are not pretty little hybrid tea roses. The roses of that time were quite fragrant, but they were a wild variety that grew without human cultivation. And we think they're all extinct today, but we know they had small daisy-like blooms and flowered within tall, heavily armored wild thickets that were originally found growing wild on the flanks of the Zagros Mountains. I don't know if you remember from the first net, but you have the area of Mesopotamia, and then off to the east is where the Zagros Mountains are. So the roses usually had 8 petals, so of course they were also associated with the planet Venus, which was Inanna's morning and evening star, because what was sacred to the goddess would naturally be reflected in both her domains, heaven and earth. Now the Akkadian word for these roses was, and pardon me, I'm going to say things and I'm sure my pronunciation is going to be terrible, but I'm going to give it my best bet. So the Akkadian word for the roses is amordinu, which translates specifically to a wild rose bush with pronounced canine tooth-like prickles. And they were believed to embody Inanna's paradoxical nature. For example, the amordino has androgynous connotations in Mesopotamian literature. And at the same time with that androgyny, the rose hips, the blossoms, and the fragrance were all allegorically coded as feminine, while the prickles, the imposing thickets, and the wildlife that dwelled within them was coded as masculine. And consequently, like Inanna herself, the amordino were considered liminal, in between spaces. And so people planted them as hedges and windbreaks and boundary markers so that they physically occupied borderlands between ordered life and wilderness. And then to return to the stories of Inanna, amongst the May, which Father Enki gifts to Inanna, she lists the art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, both descent to and ascent from the underworld, the black garment and the colorful one, along with the loosening of the hair and also its binding, the art of the hero, of power, of treachery and straightforwardness, the plundering of cities and setting up of lamentations, and the rejoicing of the heart, deceit, the rebellious land, and the art of kindness, travel, and the secure dwelling place. And that's just some of them. But for example, some of the connections between these May aren't really apparent to us today. Like, why are the gifts of the bitter-toothed lion, the kindling and putting out of fire, the weary arm, the assembled family, and procreation all listed together? We don't know. All we can do is try to remain mentally accepting of the different mindset, which is relating the ambiguity, which is Inanna. So as far as we know, one of the first stories that was written down by Enheduanna is the one with Inanna and Ebih. So let's do a very quick review. At this point, Inanna is a young goddess, but she's also a smart pre-planner who has excellent manners. When she recognizes Mount Ebih is not behaving correctly, she herself still behaves properly to complain about Ebih to An, the supreme sun god. She prepares for visiting An by cleaning herself, dressing beautifully, and she brings food offerings. When An welcomes her, she kneels to show respect before politely requesting his assistance in reprimanding the arrogant mountain. In this particular part of the story, she is shown following the rules of proper deportment. So what has Mount Ebeh actually done? It has actually ended up freezing the natural passage of time on its flanks, maintaining a constant fruiting without winter rest, a constant mating without the possibility of pregnancy or rebirth, a constant artificial peace that makes natural enemies lie down together. Effectively, it has blocked Inanna's sacred cycle of life, death, and rebirth, locking all its inhabitants into a preserving sameness, like flies in amber. They have had the gift of change stolen from them. Further, by forcefully severing all its inhabitants, including humanity, from the natural cycle of life, the mountain has arrogantly reframed nature itself as merely a tool, something to manipulate and exploit, something to control, to dominate. What Ebih has done is create a paradise from a patriarchal perspective, eternal childhood without carrying a responsibility, because someone else is doing all the work and suffering to maintain those selfish levels of complete comfort. The energetic costs to maintain this stagnant situation must be staggering. Frankly, it is no wonder that Inanna rages against the mountain. She personally has experienced the gifts of growing maturity, of sexual desire, and of love. She understands how precious they are in a way that seems to escape the older and more phlegmatic An. Perhaps he secretly fears change, or maybe he longs for this artificial illusion of paradise, but the poem doesn't say. What it does say is that Inanna recognizes An's reticence to correct what is wrong, and she steps into the personal maturity required to correct the imbalance herself, a maturity that An is clearly shirking. This is where an interesting thing happens in the poem. Since proper deportment is not restoring order, clearly it is time for more drastic action. The kneeling Inanna manifests this maturity when she stands up before An, declaring that she shall restore righteousness and the cosmic order herself. In a way, she's like a loving mother who knows her children must make their own mistakes and experience life in all its joy and suffering so that they may grow and mature. And for this, Inanna will free her children from the mountain's unnatural hold and restore them to natural cyclical life. So let's pause here to ask, what was Ebih really? Some scholars believe the story is symbolic of a rebellious town that was defeated by Enheduanna's nephew, Naram-Sin, near the westernmost Zagros mountain range, which I mentioned before. That's where the Sumerians believed that foreign barbarians and dangerous wild things all lived. However, in her book, Eruptions of Inanna, Dr. Gran argues, convincingly to me, that Ebih is actually a volcano in the Zagros. Now, keep in mind that the people of this time didn't know that volcanoes occur due from fiery pressure from below thrusting upwards. And when you're faced with something new and unfamiliar, humans tend to try and compare it to what they know already. So, for example, anyone who's been splashing through a puddle during the winter rains at that time would know that a sharp downward stomp creates a wonderful upward spray. And similarly, anyone who's seen a blacksmith knows how the hammer blows, which strike downwards, create a brilliant spray of sparks off of the molten metal. That being the case, it could seem perfectly logical to the ancient Sumerians to see a far-off mountain dramatically erupting and believe that the cause must be an immensely powerful deific strike from above, downwards. So, in support for this theory, I thought, let's check. Are there other similar existing examples in the Sumerian stories? And interestingly enough, there's the story of Ninurta and Asag, though the god isn't as effective a warrior as the later Inanna. In the first attack, Ninurta has to flee a painful dust storm with, and this is a quote from the translation, shattered potsherds in it, which is sent by Asag, the mountain. Which is interesting because this is very much like how volcanoes eject ash, volcanic gases, and hot silicate fragments that are called pyroclasts, all of which can be incredibly lethal to us. So, I mean, Ninurta was perfectly valid in fleeing. I'm not trying to downplay that. Later, Ninurta succeeds in destroying the rogue mountain, but the story relates that the waters rise, and we're not sure what we think, maybe seawater, we're not sure. And the fresh water no longer flows, just as similarly, and this is not in the poem, this is what we know, volcanic action can disrupt the water tables below them. Fortunately, in the poem, Ninurta hastily figures out how to pile up rocks into a dam or a canal to prevent the upwelling waters. So do we see similar descriptions with Inanna and Ebih? Again, yes, we do. Inanna puts a choking cloud of dust over Ebih, along with the same rain of shattered pot shards. She places battering rams against the mountain's sides, which would likely provoke the same sort of distant rumbling caused by an active volcano. And she's described in the poem as sending snakes of fiery poison to creep down its sides. And to me, that just sounds tremendously like streamers of lava. Now, in the end, Inanna subdues and defeats the mountain, just as humans might defeat and subdue a dangerous wild bull. So once the unnatural mountain has been defeated, Inanna builds her temple on the very land which proud Ebih misappropriated. And she does this both as a blessing and to restore the land to its normal and natural fecundity. Now, I see this story as a matrifocal one which highlights the natural cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and emphasizes the inevitable nature of our connections, as in a community which understands it is an interwoven element within nature itself, and which consequently strives for sharing, fairness, and sustainability, all in the name of the divine feminine. In contrast, I see the story of the Garden of Eden as a patriarchal one, a deliberate and personally, I think, somewhat malign twisting of Inanna's narrative mythos. However, in order to support this rather bold statement, obviously I'm going to need to demonstrate several proofs, such as, for one, a connection between Palestine and Sumer, two, that much of the Bible's mythology reflects previous Sumerian stories, and also three, that the Sumerian matriarchal symbols are in fact denigrated and or obliterated by patriarchal symbology in the Bible story of the Garden of Eden. Fortunately, that's not going to be difficult. So first, scholars guesstimate that Enheduanna's life occurred around 2285 to 2250 BCE, which means that she wrote her lovely prose sometime in that time frame. However, writing down the Bible stories didn't even start until about 1400 BCE, so the Sumerian stories definitely predate the biblical ones. We also know from the many tablet fragments found that court scribes copied and recopied Enheduanna's writing, probably as writing practice as well as memorization of the holy hymns, for almost 2,000 years after Enheduanna's time. I don't know if y'all can see this slide very well, but the red line that goes up and then down is the migration route that Sarah and Abraham took from Ur to Palestine. So from recent scholarship, as well as some of the Bible verses, we know that Sarah and Abraham were quite likely both literate and educated people who were trained as scribes in Ur before they traveled from there to, eventually, Palestine. And as Sumerian scribes, they have been very familiar with Enheduanna's evocative hymnals. So now we've established a connection between Sumer and Palestine. Are there actually any biblical stories which appear to reflect earlier Sumerian ones? The answer is yes, actually quite a few. There is, for example, the Sumerian king Ziusudra, who is also known as Utnapishtim, I hope I did that right, in Akkadian. The king was warned by Enki in time to build a great boat to save his people from a terrible flood, long before Noah is supposed to have built his ark. Also, there are so many stories of philosophical debate which address humanity's place in the world that it's referred to as Sumerian disputation form, with examples such as Nignam Nukal, which translates as nothing is of value, the Babylonian Theodicy, or Ludlul Bil Nimeki, which translates as the poem of the righteous sufferer, And even Enheduanna's story of her painful exile and eventual reinstatement by her beloved Inanna is written in classic Sumerian disputation form. And that style is pretty directly reproduced in the much later books of both Ecclesiastes and of Job. The story of Cain and Abel, that appears to be a later reflection of the story of Emesh and Entin, although the Sumerian version ends with Enlil getting the brothers to reconcile, rather than one of them brutally murdering the other as occurs with Yahweh. There are also multiple wisdom compositions which collect and preserve sagacious sayings of the time. Man and his God, instructions of Shurupak, Shema Milka, which translates as Hear the Advice, the Ballad of Early Rulers, Enlil and Namzitara. And again, we see the later Bible has a bit of wisdom composition as well. Ecclesiastes again, and the book of Proverbs. At least 5 of the Sumerian hymns and stories are ritual lamentations, which were musically performed by a particular class of the clergy so as to symbolically recognize the authority and supremacy of the deities. And that clear recognition was supposed to mean that the goddesses and gods wouldn't need to perform any further destructive demonstrations of their power. And the examples we've got are the lament for Sumir and Urim, and later laments for the loss of the cities of, individually, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk. And this poetic writing form, if not for the same reason, is clearly emulated within the much later biblical book of Lamentations. And finally, of course, there's the story of Ebih, the rebellious mountain, which I believe is later revised through a very different conceptual lens into the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. So, how are the matriarchal symbols subverted by the patriarchal mindset, the way I'm claiming that they are? In order to describe this, we have to take a moment to review a few of the structural underpinnings of patriarchal thought. Perhaps most important is the concept of vertical hierarchy, which is shaped like a point-up triangle. There's an example of it in the slide. Power, wealth, and property all flow up the pyramid, and coercion, exploitation, and domination all flow downwards to the many. Up the pyramid to the few, down the pyramid to the many. Now, since it's important to those in power to maintain that hierarchy and keep receiving the privilege and riches that they believe are rightfully theirs, they employ binary thinking, which is a simplified mindset where only 2 oppositionally and mutually separate options are possible. And here's an example. If man is sacred and placed on high, is strong, bright, active, he's intelligent and reasoning, he's civilized, he's right and good, then by definition, binary thinking automatically oppositionally defines woman, and she becomes profane and low, weak, dark, passive, foolish and emotional, carnal of nature, wrong and just bad. Now, the problem with this kind of thinking is it is insidious. It's both unconscious and symbolic to the point you don't even realize sometimes that you're doing it. And worse, the internal confidence that this creates is addictive. You can speak strongly and confidently, never questioning or fearing you might actually be incorrect because you were taught, you know. By definition, there are only 2 possibilities. There cannot be any in between. There's no nuance, no complexity. It's black or it's white. Consequently, if woman is definitionally bad, wrong, even evil, then her symbols must be too, right? That's exactly what we see in the Eden myth with its incredible smear campaign on the serpent. I don't apologize for the slide. I had to try and find a happy Eve with the serpent. And so that's what I put into the AI generator. So I prefer a happy Eve with the serpent. But anyway, to return to what I'm displaying here. From a wise and beautiful symbol of the natural cycle of life, the poor snake got recast as a deceiver and a seducer. And yet a really critical read of the Bible verse reveals he actually only speaks truth. Unlike what Adam asserts to Eve, Simply touching the tree of the knowledge of good or evil does not kill them. And instead, for helping Eve and Adam free themselves from Yahweh's artificial little closed terrarium, the serpent is invariably cast as the villain of this piece. The next element is the vertical hierarchy of male over female, as well as man over nature. For example, the feminine divine is completely replaced with an abusive father figure. This is abuse in a way that just takes your breath away. He sets up his creations to fail, and then he punishes them when they inevitably do so. And then things get worse. Despite how poorly Adam behaves through the story, blame is laid entirely on Eve, and by extension, the female sex. But Eve is the last one created. So if everything is made in increasing order of wonderfulness, then wouldn't that mean that she, rather than Adam, was the most beautiful and blessed? According to the actual words that are written down in the Bible, she's also the first theologian, the first rationalist, the first to take responsibility and act independently, and the first to spare a caring thought for her partner. It is Adam who is the first liar, not Eve or the serpent. I could go on and on about Eve. Feel free to ask questions, but I'm going to cut it short and not burble about it and just keep moving on in this presentation, because the final, and in my opinion, the most tragic betrayal is this. Instead of being an inherent, normal component of the bountiful web of life, humans are now cut off from it. They've been severed by the male god from their intuitive, instinctive connection with nature. Living in the beautiful, bountiful, amazing natural world is no longer a wonderful part of being alive. Instead, it's been recast as punishment. This quote from Carol Christ, Dr. Christ impressed the heck out of me with this particular article. And I'm just going to read the last two paragraphs because I think they're critically important. The symbols associated with important rituals cannot fail to affect the deep or unconscious structures of the mind of even a person who has rejected these symbolisms on a conscious level. Symbol systems cannot be simply rejected. They must be replaced. Where there is not any replacement, the mind will revert to familiar structures at times of crisis, bafflement, celebration, or defeat. So, in Inanna and Ebih, both Enheduanna and Inanna see the stagnant, self-centered, backwards longing patriarchal future that is symbolically represented by Ebih, and they do their best to prevent it. Like her end priestess, Inanna is a forward-looking proponent of community rooted in the natural cycles of life, growth, death, and rebirth. In contrast, the story of the Garden of Eden is just painfully patriarchal. Its emotional tone is one of longing nostalgia, gazing backwards in a sentimental pining for a perfectly safe, effortless, and thoughtless, but also totally fictional childhood. It is based in a fear of both death and change, and consequently a fear of women and all non-patriarchal beings as agents of that birth, death, and change. Much like in Enheduanna, I'm telling my story as a warning against the excess of patriarchy, which are currently on the rise in the US today, and also as a guide towards a more forward-thinking and more forward-moving matrifocal thought pattern. I want to reiterate the symbolic message from Inanna, which Enheduanna faithfully recorded for us. Do not lose your embeddedness in your innate, instinctive, natural environment. Remember and revere the natural cycles of life. Don't fear change. It is an ordinary, healthy constant in life, which allows us to avoid patriarchy's destructive greed, stagnation, and eventual anomie. Treasure emotions, even when they lead to conflict, because wisely navigating conflict is part of healthy, normal growth and maturity into adulthood. Personally, I believe it is the right of all free-thinking, unafraid women, men, and others to choose and tell their own validating stories. Like Enheduanna, like Inanna, we need to take up our innate strength and power, and we need to leave Eden's selfish, childish stagnation behind. The pen has always eventually been mightier than the sword, after all. Let us remember we are naturally spiritual beings. Let us read and write and perform our own sacred texts and rituals, and let us bring balance and harmony with nature and ourselves back into our world and our communities once more. Thank you so much for your time and attention.